Hello, my name is Marcella Rizzuti, and I will be the moderator for this digital session. If this is the first series conference session that you're joining, welcome. In some ways, the COVID-19 pandemic has acted as a catalyst for increased corporate transparency and accountability. The public health crisis has accentuated the need for businesses to include a wider, broader social purpose of their activities and the treatment of their workers. We've seen countless examples in the past year of companies that did not center the safety of their workforce and are now being held accountable by investors and the public. Investors are increasingly developing strategies to understand how their engagement, research, and portfolio decisions can be tools for meaningfully addressing persistent and systemic human rights issues, including those presented in the Ceres Roadmap 2030. So how do we apply some of those ideas of transparent data, coordination, and engagement to the much larger and systemic human rights issues prevalent in our economy? To share their expert insights on this topic, I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. Gerardo Reyes of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Rabbi Raquel Controster of the ICCR, and James Coldwell of the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers is a worker-led organization dedicated to the protection of human rights in corporate supply chains. The CIW's innovative Fair Food program is a unique partnership among farmers, farm workers, and retail food companies that ensures humane wages and working conditions for workers. The second initiative this session will highlight is the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. The WDI is a mechanism for companies to disclose consistent and comparable fundamental workforce data that is crucial to investors to conduct robust analysis and engagements with companies they invest in. With that, James, I am pleased to turn it to you to start our session.
Well, thanks very much, Marcella, for the introduction and for having me here today. My name, as you said, is James Coldwell, and I head up the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, which is an investor-backed program to improve and, where possible, to standardize corporate reporting on a broad range of workforce topics, everything from gender diversity at board level right the way through to a company's policies relating to collective bargaining in its tier one supply chain. The WDI, the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, has been run by Share Action, the responsible investment NGO, since 2016. So we're now into our fifth annual cycle. And the WDI really came about in response to investor calls for better and more comparable data on workforce issues so that they, investors, could better incorporate these issues into their company analysis and into their ongoing stewardship activities. So the WDI was conceived primarily in response to investor demand, and we remain powered by and supported by a coalition of institutional investors. Today in March, we have 53 institutional investors in the signatory coalition with $7 trillion US dollars in assets under management. And investors make use of the data that is generated by the WDI in three main ways. They use parts of the data to inform their company analysis for particular impact funds. Just as one example, there is a UK asset manager that uses WDI data to inform its stock selection for a particular impact fund that looks to invest in companies providing decent working opportunities. It is very common for our investor signatory group to use the WDI data as an engagement tool. So I think very often the WDI acts as a starting point for a conversation on particular workforce topics between investors and their investee companies. And lastly, and this is a more recent use of the WDI information, investors are also starting to incorporate WDI data into their proxy voting analysis. This has only just come about in the last few weeks, but it's something that we're very excited by because it's starting to suggest that members of our investor coalition are now expecting their investee companies to be responding to the survey that we send to companies every year, or at least be able to explain why they can't do that. And I think we are about to publish our 2020 findings report. That will be released on the 31st of March. There are some more information about that launch event on the 31st on the WDI LinkedIn page. So you can go onto LinkedIn and look for Workforce Disclosure Initiative. But the headline figure is that the number of companies reporting information to the WDI increased again in 2020. There are now 141 of the world's largest listed companies that report information to our data platform. And so I'll look forward to the conversation and hearing about what other colleagues have been working on in this area.
Hello, my name is Gerardo Reyes, and I've been with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers since 1999. Originally, the CIW focused on the agricultural industry, basically the farm owners, but it became clear that large retail food chains had a lot of leverage over farms and that they were using that power to demand lower prices. The low prices translated into below poverty wages and dehumanizing working conditions for farm workers. At the same time, the retailers, unlike farms, were susceptible to consumer pressure in consumer campaigns. And CIW began with the Taco Bell boycott to force change in the industry. That's where we all started to focus our efforts on the retailers. This focus on retailers is one of 5 key differences between worker-led social responsibility and traditional voluntary CSR. And I want to cover all 5 because investors often don't understand how we are different from CSR, corporate social responsibility, or other social certifications. So in this slide, we are going to talk about, number 1, the retail buyers enter legally binding commitments, contracts they sign with CIW to commit to buying produce from farms that participate in the Fair Food Program, and to stop buying from farms that are suspended for non-compliance. They also commit to paying a premium, roughly a penny per pound, a little bit over a penny a pound, which gets passed directly to workers in the form of a bonus in their paycheck, clearly marked. We have some of the largest retailers participating with us. They have made a commitment, including Whole Foods, Walmart, and McDonald's. Number 2, we are a worker-led effort. Workers create the Fair Food Code of Conduct to address the specific abuses they know are happening in the fields. For example, we have specific requirements for shade and clean drinking water that address what workers are exposed to from climate change. And we address increased workers' migration by establishing clear recruitment channels. Number 3, workers go to farms and educate other workers on the program and their rights. I'm part of the education team of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and we cover every farm participating on the Fair Food Program. Number 4, we have a 24-hour complaint hotline answered by the Fair Food Standards Council investigators to speak to workers in their languages. With this hotline, workers became the frontline monitors of their rights. In addition, Fair Food Standards Council investigators handle the complaints from intake to resolution. And because the threat of suspension has real consequences in terms of loss of health for farms, most complaints are resolved within weeks. That's the power of that incentive. And number 5, the Fair Food Standards Council conducts deep dive audits in farm offices and in the fields, interviewing 50% of the workers on every farm as a minimum. The audits are not paid by the farms being audited either, eliminating the conflict of interest that it can create. And slide 2, really quick. No other program can point to real results, the results that we can show. How compliance has changed on farms over time, and the elimination of forced labor and sexual assault on participating farms, and real benefits for workers' lives. This makes the Fair Food Program and the model that emerges out of this program, the worker-driven social responsibility code, and model that we're asking people to understand a little bit more about, so effective and the golden standard in regards to not just identifying problems, but preventing them from happening because of the market consequences and the work we do with growers, as well as with our community that are actively participating in letting the system know what the problems are with clear protections for them. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Contraster, and I'm the incoming Executive Vice President at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, ICCR. ICCR is a coalition of faith and values-based investors who view shareholder engagement with corporations as a powerful catalyst for social change. Our guiding principle as shareholders is that sustainable corporations have to look beyond the next earning report to account for the full impact of their business on society. And they have to be responsible for viewing the well-being of all their stakeholders, including their workers and the communities in which they operate, as integral to their long-term success. And what's really important to me is that a core strategy of our work is guided by the fact that many of our members have deep ties with communities impacted by human rights abuses, who are holding the corporations at the top of supply chains accountable for those abuses. And we're learning to be guided in our engagement by the leadership of the workers and those who are directly impacted, who need to not just be at the table, what we think of as worker voice or stakeholder voice, but actually worker leadership, what Gerardo talked about as worker-driven social responsibility, requiring not just disclosures from companies, but transparency is a really key hallmark of human rights, but also binding commitments with market consequences. And as investors who are invested in both communities and in the long-term value of the companies in which we're engaging, we're able to raise risks to companies early around issues like workplace safety, wages, and paid sick leave. And you can see the importance of investors raising these systemic risks early with companies playing out now during the COVID-19 crisis. For example, in Arkansas, the worker group Venceremos has been engaging with Tyson Foods, together with ICCR member Investor Advocates for Social Justice, around issues of workplace safety in poultry for years. And that became national headlines in the spring when workers in Tyson plants were getting sick and dying. And so this year, ISJ filed a human rights due diligence proposal at Tyson Foods led by the American Baptist Home Mission Society with 22 co-filers. And after the brutal toll that COVID-19 has taken on the Tyson workforce, we were really pleased to see that some of the large institutional investors also supported this human rights proposal. And this proposal is really a model for what values-based investors can do. It uplifts the importance of worker voice in the design, implementation, and monitoring of human rights due diligence. And so now we're seeing increased investor support for worker-driven social responsibility models, which help encourage the solutions we understand are most effective at addressing human rights impacts.
Thank you all for those excellent overviews. To dive right in and begin our Q&A, I'm going to start with Gerardo. Gerardo, what would you say to companies in the audience who might be intimidated by the idea of meaningfully putting workers at the center of program design and giving them more leverage over their own working conditions? How do you bring those companies to the table?
Thank you for the question. We learned something. The events of 2020, both COVID-19 and the national reckoning of systemic racism, have taught us up to this point that the WSR model is more important than ever. It has proven effective at protecting the essential brown, Black, and Indigenous workers in the U.S. agricultural supply chain. And it can be applied in other places. We are the only program, to our knowledge, that implemented binding mandatory COVID-19 protocols for farms. We didn't have to wait for government or policy to catch up, which it has still failed, the government to do the many things that essential workers need to be protected, because we already had a system in place that enabled us to plan and implement these protocols with participating growers, which is something that even the government is lacking. What's really important is that worker-to-worker education and on-the-ground monitoring that are built into the WSR programs means that workers are monitors that can identify emerging issues and respond in real time, as our experience with COVID has proven, because there are still market consequences involved. We have built-in incentives for the growers to collaborate on solutions quickly. Workers are the experts when it comes to their human rights. Only they know firsthand the kinds of abuses that take place. Look at the guidance from the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It advises the companies doing their human rights due diligence should include hearing from the rights holders who are affected by their decisions. The UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has also said the same about complaint mechanisms, that the people who use them should play the central role in their design. In other words, workers need to be at the center of this conversation and on the driving seat of the efforts that should be supported by society in a context in which investors have a lot to offer. So we hope that we can count on your support for this. And that will be my answer. There's no need to be afraid. I think that we have a great opportunity in front of us.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think focusing on the fact that workers are the experts on what is helpful to workers is a super important takeaway from this panel. Next, I'm going to turn it over to James. James, where Gerardo and Raquel are calling on companies to implement best practices, the WDI is trying to build up the foundation of companies disclosing the baseline information. Have the events of 2020 changed companies' minds on what really counts as baseline information? And what is your survey data telling you, and what are investors now asking for?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think it's worth saying that the content of the WDI survey is very detailed, it's very broad. We think it is the most ambitious workforce reporting framework that exists. And we really do think that it's a challenge even to the most progressive companies. It's partly designed in order to highlight data gaps that some companies have. But you're quite right, of course, that people's attention has definitely shifted over the course of the last year. One benefit, I suppose you could say, for the WDI having such a broad framework is that when we came to the survey review period last year, and suddenly all our investor signatories were quite rightly concerned about COVID-19 and what companies were doing to protect their workers, we were able to incorporate a number of questions specifically about companies' responses to COVID-19, and they went within our existing health and safety section of the survey. And so it won't be a big surprise to hear that companies this year have given a lot more attention to reporting on the health and safety aspects of the WDI survey compared to last year. We have found, not surprisingly, that almost every company that responded to WDI did report to a greater or lesser extent about their response to COVID-19. But we found when we've sort of dug into some of those responses that, and again, this might not come as a huge surprise, but it's definitely borne out by our data, that whereas companies are able to talk quite confidently about what they've done for their directly employed staff, there is a much bigger gap when it comes to supply chain workers and contractors and people who are sort of more informally employed by the company. So I think there is a need for investors to sort of continue to push companies on this issue, and to say that, of course, we completely understand that you're quite right to prioritize your immediate response to COVID-19, but there does have to be continued pressure from more progressive investors to ensure that companies are that the companies' responses to COVID-19 are capturing a broader workforce than just people who are directly employed at the head office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, James. Well said. I'd love to turn it over to you, Raquel, next. Another development we saw in 2020 was Unilever's fair living wage commitment. How do you see this development further pushing corporate action? And from your perspective as a leader within the ICCR, what actions are necessary for companies to substantiate that type of commitment?
Obviously, it's important when companies are making public commitments to paying their workers more and taking responsibility for the people who are in their supply chain chains. This is an important shift in their alignment of their values in public, and they need to commit to a broader group of stakeholders than just their shareholders. But it's really important, as we've already heard, that these commitments are translated to binding agreements, and especially in this moment of racial justice, where we're hearing a lot of commitments around, from companies around in that area, that they actually do so in ways that transfer power and uphold the leadership of affected communities, and it's just not words on paper. As investors committed to social change, it's really important that the major piece of this is that companies not just create their own efforts, but support existing efforts that have proven results and that make a difference, not just for direct workers, but also for the workers in their supply chains. Because we know that a lot of these corporate pronouncements sometimes just are efforts in brand protection, and they don't create the systemic remedies that we're seeking as investors. So two things I want to highlight is that there's currently, as we're trying to seek these, as investors trying to mitigate these systemic risks and urge companies to make real binding commitments, is that there's, in support of the ongoing investor engagement with Wendy's, in support of the Fair Food Program led by investor advocates for social justice, there's currently an investor letter going around urging Wendy's to join the Fair Food Program. Wendy's is currently the target of the campaign because the Fair Food Program is, as Gerardo has mentioned, is uniquely effective for risk mitigation and compliance in agriculture. In a similar light, we're also supporting an investor letter to Hannaford Supermarket, which is a brand owned by Ahold, in support of the Milk with Dignity program of migrant justice in Vermont, which is directly modeled on the success of the Fair Food Program. And this letter also urges the company to address the material, reputational, and compliance risks related to the human rights abuses of their workers in their dairy supply chain by joining Milk with Dignity. Like the Fair Food Program, Milk with Dignity stands apart from these other compliance programs because it directly engages the workers in the business of protecting their own rights and well-being. And so as investors, the more that we can support in this moment of tremendous change, these worker-led efforts, I think we're going to see real changes for workers in supply chains.
Thank you so much, Raquel. And for audience members, we've put both of the links to these sign-on letters that Raquel has mentioned into the comments. And now turning it back to James, when we think about changing corporate behavior, it's obviously, as we've talked about, so important to take a holistic systems change approach to this work that is so intersectional. How do you see the WDI's position to help accelerate that systemic change work?
Okay, so the number of workers that are covered by WDI disclosures reached 12 million last year. So there are 12 million workers directly employed by the companies which responded to WDI last year. These are companies that are headquartered in 20 countries and include many of the world's largest firms. So if we can normalize more transparency and more ambition on disclosure around working practices within these very large companies, then that is naturally going to have an impact on very large numbers of workers. And I think secondly, where WDI has an important role to play, we know that there is increasing demand for greater convergence on corporate reporting. We hear that from companies, we hear that from investors, we hear that from governments and regulators. We think there is an important role for WDI to play to make sure that as efforts at convergence gather pace, that the standards remain very ambitious and crucially that they remain worker-centric.
Finally, I want to turn it to Gerardo. Can you tell us about what corporations and buyers the CIW is working to get to sign on to the Fair Food Program?
Sure. Well, any industry where corporations at the top of the supply chain can use their market power to help workers implement the changes they want to see on the ground can be part of this. In the garment industry, we have agreements. There's an agreement, WSR agreement in place to address gender-based violence in the industry, in Lesotho, the textile industry. Construction is another where developers of large construction projects have the power to demand better working conditions. And there are efforts to implement something that is a WSR, worker-driven social responsibility model in Minnesota through an organization called Setul. Currently, we're focusing on Wendy's. They are the only major fast food chain that has refused to join onto the Fair Food Program. Right now, we have a campaign. There's a boycott of Wendy's, but we're asking investors to unite their voices with us to demand altogether that Wendy's join onto the Fair Food program. I think that it is long overdue.
Thank you, Gerardo. And we'll include links to both the Wendy's sign-on letter and the letters that have been mentioned in the comments section. So that concludes our session. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to join us and sharing their insightful thoughts, as well as to all of you for taking part in today's session. In closing, I want to hand it over to our panelists to give a quick call to action and summation. I'll start with you, James, to give a quick closing remark.
Whether you're ahead of the curve or you're just starting out, the WDI can help your firm show its commitment to improving workers' rights. To find out how, contact us today at wdi@shareaction.org.
I'm calling on investors to support the letters I mentioned, calling on companies to join Milk with Dignity and the Fair Food Program, and encouraging all investors with a focus on human rights and caring for people and planet to become part of ICCR at iccr.org.
I'm just going to emphasize, there are real changes that are taking place. As we saw earlier, some of the slides, $34 million that have been distributed so far as part of the Fair Food program, thousands of complaints that have been taken, investigated, and resolved, and a change in dynamics of power between workers and their employers that have resulted in people being protected in times of COVID, which is not something that the suppliers that are part of other corporations like Wendy's that are not participating on any of these can say. So if you care about the supply chain, the workers that are part of it and their dignity, there are concrete things that can be done. And one of them is to stand with us in asking Wendy's to do the right thing. We cannot afford to continue like this. And you all know about the consequences for essential workers. Essential need to acquire the true meaning when we're referring to people, not just a word that it's placed on top of communities that we expect to do everything to fit us. It needs to change. And I think that you all are a key element in bringing those demands with us to these corporations and supporting our efforts, understanding that this is a worker-led movement and we are at the forefront. We know what we need, but we need you to be able to achieve it. And I think we all owe that, at least that, to each other.
Well said. Thank you, Gerardo. And thank you so much to James and Raquel as well for joining us. And that concludes our session. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.